Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, Tom Shugart, an adjunct senior fellow with the Defense Program at the Center for New American Security, discusses the growing reach and rise of China's military. Shugart focuses especially on the maritime domain, where what he terms the Malacca dilemma has motivated China to develop a maritime capability to protect the important sea lines of communication through which their oil and important commerce flow. As Shugart details in his presentation, the capability to control and protect these from China's perspective also gives them the capability to shut them down or to threaten other regional economies. Shugart discusses in depth the scope of Chinese military growth over the past 2 decades and its implication for security in the Indo-Pacific region. This talk was held at the University of Texas Austin and was jointly sponsored by the Clements Center and the Strauss Center at the University of Texas Austin. Let's listen in.
I graduated in 1995 with a degree in mechanical engineering, and I never would have guessed that I'd be back here someday at the LBJ school talking about this sort of stuff. But the rise of China has brought all sorts of surprises, so here we are. More specifically, I was asked to talk to you today about China's military development and how it could affect our global future, which it will, and quite likely in dramatic ways. I'd like to start by talking about the intertwining nature of China's economic opening and their military strategic expansion. So I think a lot of you have seen this sort of chart before, but I think it's worth putting some of these things together. In that over the last several decades, the world has observed the meteoric rise of Chinese economic power following the opening up of its economy roughly 40 years ago. Now, while the economic empowerment of China has lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, and that's a good thing, and benefited consumers of Chinese-produced goods, also a good thing, it's also led to historic improvements in Chinese military power. But this process has not simply been a matter of China having additional funds for military purchases. It's a self-reinforcing cycle where the growing array of Chinese overseas interests has driven increased Chinese perceptions of insecurity, on top of the historical grievances and regional territorial issues, which I'm sure this crowd is familiar with. So that feeling of insecurity is illustrated by what was described by Hu Jintao, I'm sure many of you have heard of, as the Malacca dilemma, a recognition that China's sources of energy supply has come largely by sea and could be interdicted by hostile foreign nations. Now, prior to China's industrial development, this dilemma didn't exist. But as China's economy has grown and become ever more dependent on seaborne access to overseas resources and markets, this feeling of maritime insecurity, as well as the resulting appetite for the naval means to reduce it, continues to grow. Now, before economic growth and military modernization began, the PLA had essentially no ability to directly harm most regional nations' vital interests or territorial integrity. While the PLA possessed one of the world's largest ground forces, it had little ability to project power outside its own borders. At sea, early PLA Navy doctrine was focused on coastal defense. This reflects the heritage they got from the Soviet Navy. The PLA Air Force had no forward air bases, no air refueling capability, and very limited standoff missile capability. China's land-based missiles, which many of you may know now as the PLA Rocket Force, back then the 2nd Artillery Corps, consisted of small numbers of long-range nuclear missiles, as well as conventional ballistic missiles, too inaccurate to hit anything but cities. Think of the Scud missiles during the Gulf War. They basically hit the desert, and every once in a while get lucky. Now, as the international scope of China's economic interests has expanded, China's strategic horizons have broadened correspondingly. The mid-1980s saw the first transformation of the PRC's naval strategy to one of offshore defense of China's near seas, which you can see here inside the first island chain. That is, the first island chain which runs from Malaysia through Indonesia, the Philippines, and Japan. China's leaders established at that time, back in the 1980s, 3 broader goals for the PLAN. By 2000, developing forces sufficient to exert control over the first island chain and those sea regions within it. By 2020, basically our time now, extending control out to the second island chain. And by 2050, and what's in our future, a truly global Navy. In 2004, President Hu Jintao provided a further update to the PLA's guidance with new historic missions that broadened the PLA's goals to encompass far seas defense, covering seas past the first island chain and out into the open Pacific and beyond. The PRC's 2015 Defense White Paper explicitly included the defense of overseas interests and strategic lines of communication, or sea lines of communication, SLOCs, in its goals to be accomplished by the added mission of open seas protection, which is what we're seeing now. The 2019 Defense White Paper continued this theme, declaring a need to develop far seas forces and overseas basing facilities. That was a previously disavowed practice for China. As outgoing PLA Navy Admiral Wu Shengli said in 2017, and this is important to note, wherever the scope of the nation's interest extends, that is where the perimeter of our combat development will reach, and they have worldwide economic interests. Now, China's desire to protect its overseas interests and its SLOCs might be regarded as anodyne. After all, such an objective on the part of most other nations would raise little alarm, and many nations say this in their national security guidance. But this is largely because, in almost all cases, those nations, anybody but them or us, lacks the real ability to defend their SLOCs on a global basis. China is different. China has the motivation, they have the maritime industrial might, and the resolve, it appears, to give these words an entirely different meaning. A stated strategy that, if it's actualized, will take the form of naval capability of a scale that most observers have yet to comprehend. Now, in terms of the facilities necessary to underwrite expanding Chinese power projection and sea control across the Indo-Pacific, we can already see that China has been engaged in a massive campaign to build air and maritime facilities spanning the region. I'm sure as foreign policy experts you'll know this, the BRI, or Belt and Road Initiative. Ostensibly an effort focused on economic development, many of its resulting projects fall in highly strategically useful places and are often of an uneconomic nature. So left and right here we have Lamu, Kenya, Lekki, Nigeria, and Ream, Cambodia. This is all commercial imagery of these port facilities that are being built around the world. Now, one should consider also China's now well-publicized and explicit policy of military-civil fusion, where state-owned enterprises are required by law to provide support and assistance for the PLA. In this case, we have these facilities. I saw this a couple months ago, a news story in Baltimore. Hey, great, we've got these new cranes that are coming to the port in Baltimore. And I recognized the name of one of the ships, the Zhenhua 24. And I thought, that sounds familiar. I wonder, that sounds like a Chinese ship. Sure enough, you look it up, Zhenhua 24 right there is owned by ZPMC. ZPMC is a subsidiary of, I forget which SOE it is, but it's one of the blacklisted Chinese SOEs that blacklisted because they work with the PLA. Sure enough, days later, the FBI raided the ship and found intelligence gathering equipment on board. So their companies are not like our companies. They have a requirement to support the PLA. And we should remember that. This military civil fusion stuff is for real. Yeah, so as for China's claims of the peaceful and civilian nature of the facilities it is building overseas, like the ones I showed you a minute ago, we should keep in mind Xi Jinping's personal pledge delivered directly to President Obama in the White House Rose Garden that China did not intend to militarize the South China Sea. That same South China Sea, now dominated by huge artificial islands that bristle with missiles, which constitute just the first step, and this is what's most important, in a series of strong points positioned to help ensure Chinese control over its critical SLOCs. As China's strategic horizons have broadened, China has engaged in the largest and most rapid expansion of maritime and aerospace power in generations. Now, based on its scope, its scale, and the specific capabilities related to it, this buildup appears to me to be designed foremost to threaten the United States with ejection from the Western Pacific and thereafter to achieve domination in the region. Now, some of the most obvious manifestations of this buildup, and that China's military development is not defensive in nature, can be seen in three specific areas. The development of huge numbers of long-range conventional ballistic missiles, a major expansion of the capabilities of China's long-range bomber force, and the explosive growth of China's blue water navy. So first, China's ballistic missile force. Already, by far, the world's largest missile force, the PLA rocket force, continues to grow at a rate that only makes sense for the purpose of severely threatening US and allied capabilities across the region. This is most apparent in China's force of DF-26 intermediate-range ballistic missiles. I'd say arguably the crown jewel of the Chinese military. Specifically, the US government's 2020 China Military Power Report revealed an apparent more than doubling in a single year of China's inventory of DF-26 launchers to 200. Now, in terms of available missile inventory for those launchers, the report only lists 200 plus as the estimated number. So we know from Chinese television footage that the DF-26 units practice reloading missiles routinely, and that the missiles have different warhead types that are swappable. So if each of these launchers had only one reload missile available, and there may be more than that, this would mean an IRBM force of more than 400 missiles, nearly all configurable to anti-ship or land attack missions. This is in addition to the rocket force's hundreds of increasingly capable ground-launched cruise missiles. So we have, this is what we're talking about, DF-26 range, and then our older DF-21 range. So, yeah, so going from dozens of medium-range missiles, those DF-21s I showed you there, to hundreds of much longer-range missiles will drive changes to the balance of air and maritime power in the Western Pacific on a number of different levels. And with the DF-26's long range, even out into the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf from Western China. So first, the number of available anti-ship ballistic missiles could broaden the PLA rocket force's anti-ship mission from what has traditionally been thought of as a carrier killer role to a more generic ship killer mission. Another way in which a longer range force could change things would be through the specific addition of areas that it could strike. In the Philippine Sea, for example, east of Taiwan and south of Japan, areas that were considered to be relatively safe beyond the range of the older DF-21, which I showed you there, those lie well within the range of the DF-26. Many defense thinkers previously posited the ability to operate our forces, reasonably safely outside the first island chain as a means to enable episodic operations inside the first island chain. But the risk of such operations is now considerably higher. This threat is by no means restricted to ships. In 2017, a colleague and I at the Center for New American Security estimated that a preemptive Chinese missile strike on US bases in Asia could crater every runway and every runway length taxiway at every major US airbase in Japan and destroy more than 200 aircraft on the ground. We also estimated that in addition to shorter range missiles, an inventory of approximately 60 DF-21, the shorter range MRBMs, would be necessary to conduct this strike. Given that more recent estimates are that China now possesses about 350 medium and intermediate range missiles, the threat appears to become much graver than we estimated at that time. In this picture, which you can see, this is a mock target of an airplane at a ballistic missile impact range in Western China. This is an actual E-3 AWACS at Kadena Air Base in China. These are both of the same scale, and we are the only operators of the AWACS, that E-3 AWACS in the Western Pacific. So we know what this is about. Also, I know my theory on, so if you look at the impact range and go back further in time, you can see other test targets they use. They're generally older Chinese aircraft you see them in one image and then a month later they're destroyed. You know, it appears to be shooting at spots, probably GPS latitude, longitude. Why would they need to create a mock target that looks exactly like a US airplane instead of an older Chinese airplane? My theory is basically warheads with image recognition that have the ability to pick out specific aircraft types, high value aircraft types, and hit them on the ground. This is entirely consistent with the PLA's idea of informationized warfare, where they focus on command and control nodes. That's a command and control node, an airborne one. Not good stuff, for sure, assuming it works. Of course, for all we know, this could be just something they put there to make us go crazy. I don't know, but I would assume that they're actually testing against these things. That would seem to be the conservative way to look at it. So, in addition to its missile force, China has dramatically increased the capability of its fleet of long-range strike aircraft. China has the world's only bomber factory that is operating in full rate production. We're looking at starting to build B-20 or the B-21 soon, sometime soon. And Russia apparently may be doing some limited production of their Blackjack again after a hiatus of decades. But this is the only, no kidding, full rate production bomber factory in the world that's producing H-6 bombers. These bombers are brand new, long-range aircraft seemingly purpose-built to strike our bases and to overwhelm our carrier strike groups. Now, before the last decade, China's bomber force had pretty limited capabilities. The H-6, which is the dated copy of a Soviet-era Tupolev Tu-16, only carried a small number of missiles and could deliver them to a limited range. This began to change in 2009 with the introduction of the H-6K, a major redesign and update of the airframe. Equipped with totally new avionics and new engines, the H-6K enjoys a much longer range, roughly 50% further, and is capable of carrying 3 times the number of missiles. Now, incorporating the H-6K's improvements, the PLA Navy since has gained its own maritime strike version of the aircraft. I'd note here that our Navy does not have dedicated maritime strike aircraft, but theirs does. The H-6J. More recently, China revealed the development of the H-6N, which is capable of aerial refueling and appears to carry a single air-launched ballistic missile. We possess no such weapon in our inventories. Now, China is not yet at least. Now, China is not merely replacing older bombers with improved ones. It's growing the size of the force as well. Prior to the H-6K, most estimates were that the inventory was in the mid to low 100s. So to determine the rough size of the bomber force over the last several years, I conducted surveys of available commercial satellite imagery using open source lists of Chinese bomber bases. These counts produced results of just over 200 aircraft in 2018 and more than 230 in 2020. That's not accounting, of course, for any aircraft. It's possible I may have double counted planes that moved around, but it's also not accounting for any aircraft in hangars, any aircraft that are in flight. So I think it's probably pretty accurate. Now, on to China as a maritime world power. So, in recent decades, China has grown to become the world's premier sea power by most categories. China already holds first place by some measures in the size of its fishing fleet, its merchant shipping and maritime law enforcement fleets. China's shipbuilding industry dwarfs that of the United States, building 38 million tons of shipping in 2020 compared to just over 70,000 tons from American yards in the same year. China's fishing fleet, the largest by far, is depleting fish stocks worldwide. In the vanguard of the fishing fleet is a force of government-subsidized and directed maritime militia, so in some cases specifically constructed so they can ram other fishing boats that harass and intimidate other nations' commercial vessels with Chinese warships lurking over the horizon. As you can see here, this is a chart of the Chinese flagged merchant shipping fleet relative to ours over the last several decades. Now, some people will say, well, what about flags of convenience? Aren't ships often registered places like Liberia and Panama? Yes, they are, but the news there isn't much better in terms of US-owned ships. If you expand the horizon there to US-owned versus Chinese and Hong Kong-owned, the ratio doesn't look any better, really. And one thing that worries me is that if we ever have a major conflict where there's an attempt at sea denial on our strategic stocks, during World War II, we had the ability to tell US merchant mariners and British merchant mariners to keep coming despite the fact that they might get sunk by U-boats. Do we have that ability now today when the ships are owned by the Greeks and registered in Panama or wherever? This worries me. And certainly China doesn't seem to have a problem with being able to flag their own ships under their own flag. So it's only in the realm of hard naval power that the US has retained superiority, though the trend lines, as you can see here, are distinctly negative. In recent years, the Chinese Navy has been engaged in a naval buildup, the likes of which has not been seen since the United States 600-ship Navy effort of the 1980s. As an example, during the 5 years of 1982 to 1986, the US Navy procured 86 warships. Over the 5 years, 2016 to 2020, China launched almost as many, 80. As a result, China's Navy is now the world's largest in terms of the sheer number of ships involved. Chinese shipyards have been seen churning out huge numbers of warships, including aircraft carriers, state-of-the-art multi-mission destroyers, and cruisers that are the world's largest current production surface combatants. China has also been conducting modern at-sea replenishment ships and amphibious assault ships to carry China's rapidly expanding Marine Corps. Given that there are planned or ongoing major expansions at the primary shipyards that build China's surface combatants and aircraft carriers, and also at the one that builds its nuclear submarines, it seems to me that the pace of Chinese naval shipbuilding is unlikely to slow over the long term. The PLA Navy gains great economies of scale from the fact that its shipyards are dual-use facilities that are part of China's world-class commercial shipbuilding industry. For example, here, on the left here, this is the Huludao submarine shipyard. It's also part of a commercial shipyard, so a couple hundred yards away from there are large commercial vessels under construction. This is their brand new, these buildings, you can see these are still under construction. This is all nuclear submarine building, new nuclear submarine building, in addition to the shipyard that pumped out their 6 SSBNs and the SSNs that they have. Right there, you can see this is probably the stern section of whatever they're building in there now. Maybe the Type 93B, which is a cruise missile launching version of the Shang, or it might be the Type 95, 96, their new SSBN, SSN, hard to say. Regardless, part of the bills for this are being paid by the commercial vessels that are being built nearby. Likewise, here's China's new aircraft carrier under construction in Jiangnan near Shanghai. You can see a destroyer there under construction as well. Right next door to it, commercial vessels. The ballpark estimates that I've seen is that essentially for an apples-to-apples ship, it probably costs them half what it does for our Navy to build equivalent ships. Many commentators have pointed out that China's warships have been, on average, much smaller, and that's true, and that the US Navy remains much larger in terms of its overall tonnage. But again, by that measure, the trend lines are not much better. By my calculations shown here, from 2016 to 2020, China launched more than 600,000 tons of warships, almost 50% more than the United States launched over the same period. When you consider the fact the US Navy has worldwide responsibilities with only about 60% of its forces allocated to the Pacific, the story is clearly worse in terms of regional naval power. Now, while the Pacific Fleet is currently much larger than the PLA Navy by tonnage, my estimates indicate that on current trend lines, the PLAN will reach near parity on that basis as well in 15 to 20 years. Now, on top of these obvious material manifestations of the PLA's growing reach, China's military has also undergone comprehensive structural and personnel reforms in recent years. Starting in 2015, China's military shifted from an army-dominated military regions to joint theater commands, forming a new PLA ground force headquarters and also shrinking the size of the army dramatically, elevating China's missile forces to a full service co-equal with the other PLA branches, and establishing the PLA Strategic Support Force. In conjunction with major personnel reforms, which have been underway in recent years to improve the force's professionalism, these efforts should enhance the year-round readiness of the PLA and help transform the force into one increasingly capable of conducting joint operations further afield. In addition, China's military-civil fusion strategy, which harnesses ostensibly civilian Chinese industry to serve the PLA, as I mentioned before, has begun to bear fruit in the term of standardized and organized auxiliary forces, which could provide a major force multiplier when mobilized in the event of major conflict, such as an invasion of Taiwan. I wrote an article about this recently, and the news just keeps coming. So this is a Chinese ferry, civilian ferry, required now by law to be built to military standards, which, by the way, estimates are increases the costs of such vessels, whether they're ferries or other key civilian vessels that are required to meet military standards, increases the cost by 10 to 15% of those ships. Is that included in the PLA's budget? That's often compared against the US DoD's budget? I doubt it. What got me interested in this was scrolling around Hainan Island on Google Earth Pro, as one does. I saw this really interesting, very large structure, this ferry landing that was built a couple of years ago. And I don't know how many of you have been on Washington State ferries or Staten Island ferry, but usually the ferry landing's pretty small, and the parking lot's completely full with traffic backed up into the neighborhood next door. Big empty parking lots. Lots of ferries, don't seem to be, well, I guess one of them's going somewhere. But big empty parking lots, huge ferries. That's weird. So I started to dig into this, and there were lots of other folks. Connor Kennedy at the China Maritime Studies Institute has done fantastic work on this. That started to dig into it. I did the numbers. I think I was the first person to actually go crunch the numbers. So spent a lot of time looking at marinetraffic.com, looking at ferries and building spreadsheets. And basically, ballpark triples the size of their amphibious sea lift if you count these roll-on, roll-off ferries and vehicle carriers. This is not a they might do it kind of thing either. These ships, that one is organized. They're organized auxiliary units of the PLA, organized transport groups, standardized ships, and they are practicing doing this. This is a amphibious assault vehicle going right off the back of a ferry straight to the beach. So interesting stuff. Just this week, there was a Global Times published an article where they have the newest ferry of theirs, a 45,000-ton ferry, was used in an exercise to transport, I don't know how many tanks it was a lot. Looked like a battalion or so to me. 45,000 tons, that's as big as our largest amphibious assault ships, the America class, exactly the same size. All right, finally, and we have learned in recent months what appears to be an unprecedented expansion of China's intercontinental missile forces, most likely nuclear armed, but maybe not, in the form of the construction of roughly 300 missile silos at multiple locations in Western China. When you add this to China's expanding ballistic missile submarine fleet and the looming introduction of China's own long-range stealth bomber, what we see here, to me, seems clear indications of the complete abandonment of China's historic nuclear policy of what it called a minimum deterrent. So, what does all of this mean to us and our allies? Well, as I said, it appears to me that China is building a force specifically intended to be able to eject the US military from the Western Pacific by force. What else could they be building all this for? To stare it down in a crisis, I think it do want to win without fighting, or to encourage the US to step away from its current commitments due to overstretch, defeatism, or frustration with our allies. That frustration with our allies could be inflamed by a perceived lack of commitment by some allies, particularly given the clear scale of the threat. That even a partial withdrawal of US power from the Western Pacific would accelerate the ongoing deterioration of the regional military balance, with profound consequences that I think the freedom of action for some of the regional nations, which I'm not sure that they get. Now, I would say probably the worst case scenario for regional security would be one where something like the following occurs. First, China successfully gains control of Taiwan, either through force, invasion, bombardment, blockade, or the threat thereof. And then having been relieved of the necessity of dedicating resources to the capture of Taiwan, China is able to dedicate its attention to addressing challenges further afield. Now, in a less dramatic sequence of events, the American public could become disenchanted with its security commitments in the region. Given the growing regional challenge from the PLA, the U.S. could adopt what some analysts have called an offshore balancing strategy, essentially withdrawing its main forces to the Central or Eastern Pacific and exposing regional powers to a declining military balance. This could inspire the self-neutering of formerly powerful regional allies, such as Japan and South Korea, again releasing Chinese resources and attention. Now, to gain perspective on what an American departure from the Western Pacific might look like for the regional balance, let's return briefly to the matter of fleet size, and specifically to warship building trends in the region. This figure, again, shows the total warship construction in the years 2016 to 2020 for the major seagoing navies in the Indo-Pacific. If we remove the Pacific Fleet's contribution and just have this or this, you can see here that the building trend, at least, is the PLAN would eventually exceed in size the combination of the rest of the major navies in the region and would absolutely dwarf any individual navy. These totals also don't include the significant shipbuilding of China's Coast Guard and maritime safety agencies, which have individual building programs that probably rival those of some of the regional navies. It also leaves out the PLA's land-based maritime strike and air and missile forces that I showed you, which no other regional power has anything that remotely like that. Now, even if the US doesn't make a conscious decision to withdraw its maritime forces from the Western Pacific, internal challenges may sap the relative strength of US sea power in the region. The US shipbuilding program is in turmoil, with a recognition in recent years that the previous 355-ship Navy plan was likely unaffordable, even before the large budget deficits caused by COVID-19 related spending. As a result, near the end of the Trump administration, the DoD revealed a new Battle Force 2045 plan that would rebalance the fleet away from larger ships, such as aircraft carriers and cruisers, to more numerous but smaller and cheaper vessels, many of which would be unmanned or lightly manned. But thus far, the Biden administration's budget requests come nowhere near fulfilling that plan, with only 4 warships requested in the FY21 budget, though Congress has added more. Now, if China were to achieve air and maritime dominance in the Western Pacific, what would it really mean for our regional security interests? After all, our allies and partners have been engaged in peaceful trade with China for decades now. Why would the substitution of China's gray hulls for those of the United States make a difference? The answer lies in the coercive power that China would gain over their economies, their livelihood, and perhaps even their territorial integrity, and also in the demonstrated willingness of China to engage in coercion, such as the economic coercion of Australia and South Korea. Our allies' dependence on overseas stocks is where China's long-term ambition to control its own intersects with their national security. But simply, a China that can maintain the security of its own stocks is a China that can deny them to others. This prospect, and not just the desire to counter a US intervention, is what I think truly drives the unprecedented scale of Chinese maritime expansion. It also is what threatens to give China major coercive power over the trade-dependent democracies of the Indo-Pacific. China does not need to invade to attempt to subdue them. It may only need to establish a blockade, which with the world's largest Coast Guard, 10,000-ton maritime safety vessels, and the most powerful Navy in the region over the horizon, it could be well equipped to do. My point with this slide is that if you look at China compared to the rest of the continent, it's essentially an island nation. I mean, it has very minor connections to Vietnam down here, not a particularly friendly place for them. Some connections to North Korea, also a region of darkness. But I mean, it might as well be an archipelago in terms of where the actual economic development is and where trade goes. Of note here, if you look at the numbers, even with BRI and railroad expansions, rail freight across the continent to China is single-digit percentage of China's trade to Europe, for example. It's 90% of their trade is seaborne, and they know that. They know that very well. As the reach of China's military capability grows, we need only ask the Vietnamese and the Philippines, both subjects to threats of Chinese force in recent years, what Chinese military coercion feels like. We and our allies should be clear enough to recognize that similar treatment could be in store for us, among others.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.